struggling away with this whole ideal and the fourth root of one, the fourth complex root of one, complex fourth root of one, and then the fiveness that comes into that. So, I don't know why I feel the need to explain, but just in case someone, I don't know, certain of these things that have occurred to me, whether they have occurred to me through my own study or self-reflection, or whether they've come to me from other sources, from other people, other videos. I don't know what it's all important. So, this here is the unit circle perimeter. This here. So, as this progresses, both of these circles are rolling along here, but they're slipping here and here. So that comes, I guess that reminds me of the, I'm not exactly sure what it's called, the circle of Aristotle, Aristotle's wheel, the wheel of Aristotle, something like that, where similarly there's an outside circle and an inside circle, and the outside circle rolls along a surface, a line, and then there's another line here, and as this circle rolls with it. And then the question is, how can this circle roll along this line as this circle rolls along this line? And essentially it requires slipping, but yet it appears to roll along it. And then the question, I guess the philosophical question or the logical question is, how can that happen? How can that happen in an ideal world? And then, of course, answering the question with a question would be, well, who says that would happen in an ideal world? Of course, it wouldn't happen in an ideal world, because who says an ideal world is even planar in the first place? Something else is happening. There's a number of ways that you could think about that Aristotle wheel happening.
No such thing. You'll leave only when I say you can leave. You'll continue working on Imaginaire cloud atlas.
It would be, if there were two wheels, it would be like a series of planes, like one. The rear wheel would be on one plane back here, while this other plane would be up here, both on a circle, but both on kind of like infinite circles, so far away that it appears as though they're on straight lines, but they're not. They're really on a circle, but be peering along circles more or less, staring at the disk of them. but the discs, we'd really be staring on the middle of the discs, but they'd be so far away that we wouldn't be able to discern the perspective. But anyway, the whole point of that is that they're rolling on this circle, but slipping on these circles. So I'm not really sure how that can happen. Another interesting thing about this is that, and this goes back. There was a really good book I read. Well, I say I read. I listened to a lot of audiobooks, and sometimes when I say I read something, I mean I listened to it. And there's this really good book on the infinitesimal. It had a lot to do with Hobbes and the Jesuits and the Jesuits and I forget what it was. There was the papal worldwide Catholic sect of the Jesuits, but then there was the more localized, Roman sect of, I think it was the Jesuits, but I can't remember, that they were commonly confused. It was the smaller sect, I believe, that had the claim of the aqua vitae. Yeah, it was a good book. The infinitesimal, something about the history of the infinitesimal. It had to do with, Hobbes and Wallace, the Leviathan, the conception of the Royal Institute in England. And it came down to the whole, I guess, conception of the infinitesimal. Though everything after the Dark Ages, it's hard to say what the conception was. Is the Enlightenment, was that really something new, or was that really just like bringing about the old ways of what happened before it? Like, were the Dark Ages kind of like the edge of a mirror, and what came before and what has come and will come after, in some way, is like this mirror evolution of what was and what is. So I say, like, the Enlightenment, or like the pre-Renaissance and the Renaissance. And like the pre-Renaissance came after the Dark Ages, kind of, and the Renaissance came after the pre-Renaissance, and the Enlightenment came after the Renaissance. But from the Dark Ages, before the Dark Ages, was there like a opposite pre-Renaissance, and before the opposite pre-Renaissance, before the Dark Ages, was there a pre-mirror Renaissance, and all that kind of thing. But anyway, I guess what I mean by the whole Wallace, Hobbes deal is it comes into the idea of the infinitesimal, and it comes into the idea of like the thickness of a line, which also, like, the thickness of a line in a plane is one way of thinking about like the saturation of a line. Like, for instance, here, when these lines are matched up, these lines are equal, and they should be non-dimensional, or they should be one-dimensional. And both zero dimensionality and one dimensionality should be essentially invisible to our sight. You know, but I've chosen a thickness in a way representing a mechanism, so I could in some way like represent a machine. Like, you can't build a machine in dimensionlessness. That's not a true fact, by the way. Moving on. But then as I move, being as though my larger line gets longer, it also gets thicker. The green line gets larger and thicker, while the yellow line gets shorter and thinner. So that would be one way of kind of talking about, you know, how are all lines of the same thickness, are all lines of the same density, are all lines of the same saturation. And that also doesn't really speak to the idea of like curvature of a line. And that reminds me of another book I read about, I didn't read it, I listened to it on Audible, about Euclid's window. And that book kind of stresses about how the whole fifth postulate, I think, deal about straight lines. That's the thing about a straight line. Like, what does straight mean? And like all these translations through time, and all that was lost, like in the Library of Alexandria, and all that we don't study when we're dealing with like book to book to book to book to book, and being as though I myself I've not read through. Like, how many people out there have read the entire, have worked out the entire, you know, the 13 elements, you know? Apparently, Abraham Lincoln did. Good for him, you know? Log cabin, this or that, White House, whatever, you know? Apparently, it taught him a lot. And, you know, but how many people have really went through the entire elements and the whole idea of like the Poincare disc and redefining, getting to non-Euclidean geometry and all that kind of stuff, but redefining the fifth postulate. But then, one of the big things is that like the fifth postulate was never, you know, do we even understand it in the first place? And what is a parallel line? Like, there are non-meeting lines. There are lines that we draw that appear to cross, that may be parallel. You know, like, oh, what a horrible circle. But like, these lines may be parallel. Even if we're dealing in a plane, even if we're not dealing with like a three-dimensional collapsed cross-section, if we're dealing with non-meets, if we're dealing with roots and the whole root deal, and this comes again into the idea of like the square and root. I'm doing this while I'm looking through the viewing window of my camera, so it's not super easy. But if this is 1, 1, 1, 1, and this is root 2, then, you know, that's a non-meet. This doesn't meet. We can draw it perfectly geometrically with our compass and our square and all that, but it doesn't matter. Like, that's not a meet. I mean, maybe it is, but it's just a way of thinking about it. Like, that's not a meet. That doesn't exist. So then that gets a whole, again, into the idea of the, you know, tetrahedron viewed from a different perspective looks like a square. So, you know, in this sense, this wouldn't be 1, this wouldn't be 1, this wouldn't be 1, this wouldn't be 1, and this wouldn't be root 2. That's just the way they'd appear plainly. But whatever the case may be, on the plane, these are not a meet. And then if we're talking about the whole thing surrounded in a sphere, right? this sphere, and we got this circle, and we got this circle, and we got this circle. But it's all in a sphere. So, are even straight lines permitted in the first place? So if we were looking at this, all of these spheres viewed this way would look like straight lines. So then they'd be straight lines in curvature. So then, just as when we look at the unit circle, and we look at like spread angles, where this will be 0 and this will be 1 if we're looking at spread angles, which are like, they're kind of like what logarithmic measures. And there's an exponentiality to spread angles, so like this is 1/2, and then at a third and 2/3, so at a no angle we have a 0 spread angle. At a 90. Ran out of tape on that last one, so I'll keep going. So when I say this is half of 90 degrees. So this is 0, this is tau over 4, this is tau over 8. This is tau over 8. This is tau over 12. This is tau over 6. This is a third of pi over 2, but it's a quarter in a spread angle because of the exponentiality. And this is 3/4 of a spread angle because of exponentiality, even though it's 2/3 of pi over 2. And as you go down, you just get increasing numbers until you're like 1 over a million, 1 over a billion, 1 over a gazillion, 1 over a quintillion, million, billion, Google, zillion, zillion, bammo, whammo, and fatillion, da-da-da. And this kind of goes the other way, like a gazillion minus 1 over a gazillion, megaplexagillion minus 1 over a megaplexagillion, and so on. Up toward that. Which speaks to the I don't know what to call it, exponential, logarithmic. Aspect of the spread angle, which has to speak to sphericality, which has to speak to sphericality, maybe hypersphericality, in the way in which, the spread angle, in a sense, describes how even these lines aren't lines, and as soon as you're rotating them, you're changing the aspect of the line itself, not just its orientation toward the center. And I know I'm getting that. I know I don't have it completely right, and I know I'm struggling. But it's because I don't know. And when we don't know, we have to struggle. We have to struggle to find. And in a lot of ways, I'm a big time failure. But it depends. It depends how we define success and failure. If I were to meet someone like me who was saying the things I'm saying, I recognize that I'd say, hey, you're not that bad, and it's okay, and, keep going, and keep striving for the betterment of yourself, the betterment of the world, the betterment of the complete vision. But if someone were to come to me saying that, as much as it would feel great for that comfort and for that warmth, I'd have a really, really hard time believing it. And not just because, not just because it's so difficult to accept the well wishes of others, not because it's so difficult to accept the encouragement of others, but because it's so easy to. At what point do we accurately view ourselves and not just rely upon the view of others, or there's the way people view us, and there's the way people speak of viewing us, and they may or may not align. But at what point do we view ourselves correctly? Where in our own lives, do we roll upon the proper line, the proper arc length? And where in our own lives do we slip, only appearing to roll upon the line? Once again, I'm forced to wonder, am I the dumbest, stupidest ever on the planet? And I might be. And if I am, I have to accept that. But I also, and this is like the quiet whisper that I have to hold on to as my strength. This is the quiet whisper that I have to cling to as my foundation. Having no foundation, I have to make this my foundation. That I must cling. I must cling to this hope that even if I am dumbest, the stupidest, the worst ever in all of eternity, in foreverness. If I'm the worst, the leastest, the worstest, the crummiest, the crappiest, the stinkiest, the smelliest, the smallest, but the biggest jerk. That has to be good enough. And I gotta use it the best I can.